I commend and recommend the government of Kenya to sell Safaricom shares at 34 shillings compared with the current market price of 29 shillings. But first things first, let me ask you a question. Would you agree to save 100,000 Kenya shillings with a certain financial institution on the basis that they would give you a return of 5% at the end of the year? That means your 100,000 would earn 5,000 only at the end of the year. And then before that year ends, you go to the same institution and borrow 100,000 at an interest rate of 20%, which also means that you would pay 20,000 on or as interest cost for that loan amount. Basically, you would have saved 100,000, which would generate you a return of 5,000. And on the other hand, you borrow 100,000 from the same institution and pay 20,000 Kenya shillings as an interest cost. Does that make sense? Of course, it doesn't. If that is clear, can you imagine when we are telling the government of Kenya not to sell Safaricom shares? That is exactly what we are advising the government to do. Let me break it down. You know, this entire sale that the government is selling some shares at that 4 shillings will generate for the government 200 billion Kenya shillings. And if the government does not sell, what does it stand to get at the end of the year? And let me start by saying this. There are 2 ways you can benefit by investing shares in Safaricom or any other company for that matter. Number 1 is when the share price increases. You had bought this share at 20 shillings and then at some point it goes up to 30 shillings, that a gain of 10 shillings. But this is not always guaranteed. Remember, at some point, the Safaricom shares were trading at 45 shilling per share, and that is in 2021. Today, they are trading at 29 shillings. Someone who had invested with Safaricom shares when they were trading at 45 shillings, and now at 29 shillings, they have suffered huge. So gaining and benefiting on share price appreciation is not a guarantee, and neither is dividend allocation a guarantee. But for a starter, Safaricom has been giving dividends on a dividend yield of 4%. What dividend yield means that whatever amount of money you have invested, you are being paid a return of 4%. And therefore, the government of Kenya, with an investment of 200 billion, which it stands to get if it sells the proposed number of shares, it gets 8 billion shillings only. 8 billion. Now, remember, the government of Kenya operates a deficit budget. What that means is that every year we spend more than what we are earning. In essence, this year, 2025-2026, we have purposed to borrow 800 billion Kenya shillings. But if we decide to sell Safaricom shares, this one's for 200 billion, we will borrow less. But if we borrow, what is the cost of borrowing? Whether we are borrowing from treasury bills, treasury bonds, euro bonds, IMF, the average borrowing cost for Kenya is at 10%. So we have an option. It's part of the budget to a tune of 200 billion from selling Safaricom shares or from borrowing. If we borrow, we will incur an interest expense of 10%, which translates to 20 billion Kenya shillings. But if we decide not to borrow and sell Safaricom shares at that 4 shillings, but if we decide not to borrow and sell Safaricom shares for these 200 billion Kenya shillings, we would forego an interest income of 8 billion, which is 4% of 200 billion. That is the dividends that we are likely to get at the end of the year. So the question is, you have 200 billion somewhere. Do you want to continue investing in Safaricom at a return of 8 billion at the end of the year? Or do you want not to invest this 200 billion and instead use it to fund your budget and therefore save yourself a borrowing cost of 20 billion? So if you are telling the government of Kenya to continue investing in Safaricom and at the same time to continue borrowing, you are essentially saying that this 200 billion, invest and get 8 billion, but at the same time borrow 200 billion and pay a cost of 20 billion. It does not make sense. So for that reason, I commend and recommend the government of Kenya to sell these Safaricom shares and if possible, some more. The good book, the Bible says, my people perish because of lack of knowledge. And this is essentially what you are telling our government. But my point number 2, that the only way you can, or one of the ways that you can benefit from investing in shares of any company, is through dividend allocation and distribution. But it is never a guarantee. Sometimes a company can decide not to distribute anything and to reinvest all the net profits back to the company. Perhaps it is doing expansion like Safaricom was doing a few years ago when they expanded their operations in Ethiopia. So during that time, you don't earn anything. You are not getting any income, whether you have invested 1 billion or 1 trillion, nothing. And sometimes, to make the matter worse, like it was the case during COVID, most companies did not pay dividends. And now, the government of Kenya has a choice to continue investing this 200 billion with Safaricom, or to just sell it, get the 200 billion, and avoid incurring an additional cost of 20 billion every year in terms of borrowing cost. This other issue of dividends, it's 50-50. It's guesswork. Sometimes it is there, sometimes it is not there. And the good thing with the government of Kenya, it is the government of Kenya, meaning whether it has invested in Safaricom shares or not, as long as Safaricom is operating in Kenya, just like any other company, the one that you own, the small one that I own, even a foreign company, they are supposed to pay 30% of their net profit. As assumed Safaricom in 2025, they generated a net profit of 100 billion Kenya shillings. From that, 30% is supposed to be paid to the government of Kenya as taxes. The other 70%, the government, the Safaricom can choose either to reinvest it or to give it out as dividends, but it is not guaranteed. So 30% of 100 billion is 30 billion. So that is not negotiable. Even after the Kenyan government sell their shares, Safaricom will not cease to be a Kenyan company. Now, this 4% that the Safaricom gives to the investors as a rate of return and return on investment, is it even adequate for all intent and purposes to compensate for inflation here in Kenya, knowing very well that inflation sometimes it rises up to 9%. So your money is losing value at a rate of 9% when another company is promising to give you a return of 4%. So in essence, it is a net loss of 5% on your money. So if that is very clear, this is the reason why I am commending and recommending the government of Kenya to sell these Safaricom shares as proposed, and if possible, to add some more. To my third reason why I would want the Safaricom shares to be sold is because the work of the government is not to do business with you and me or to do business with itself. The work of the government is to provide a conducive business environment. And then everything else, including the Vodafone, attracting foreign investors like the Vodafone is doing. Let them come. Business, the government should get out of business, just provide a conducive business environment. And how is the government of Kenya providing a conducive environment by selling these shares of Safaricom? That's a $1 million question. This is how. Number one, the 200 billion Kenya shillings that Vodafone will be paying to the government of Kenya, it will not be paid in Kenya shillings. It will be paid in dollars. And what does that mean? It means that the foreign currency reserve for Kenya will increase substantially and exponentially. What that means as well is that the import cover will increase drastically, and subsequently the exchange rate for Kenya shillings against the dollar will improve. So, because Kenya is a net importer, we will find it cheaper to import because the Kenyan currency has strengthened against the dollar. If we were a net exporter, the vice versa would be true. But right now, because we are a net importer, we need our currency to strengthen against the dollar. The reason why it is very important that the government of Kenya not to borrow these 200 billion from domestic market and instead to just sell these Safaricom shares is because when the government borrows locally, domestically, it competes with you and me when it comes getting money from the financial institutions. And you can never win against the government when it comes to who is to be given the money by commercial banks. Let me tell you this. The 200 billion, if the government of Kenya were to borrow 200 billion from financial banks in Kenya, this is what would happen. Any bank would prioritize the government. Why? Because government is considered a risk-free borrower. Anytime the government needs to repay that amount of money, it can borrow further so that it can use newer debts to pay maturing debts. It can borrow through treasury bills, treasury bonds, euro bonds, go to the World Bank or IMF. So, and if the worst come to worst, it can print more money. So the government is a preferred borrower compared to you and me. We would experience something that is referred as crowding out effect, where the private sector struggles to access credit because its own government is competing with them. You would even see that since now we are exposed and we are using risk-based lending here in Kenya, you would be charged higher interest rates to access credit in commercial banks compared with the government. Reason number three why would prefer the government as a borrower is because if the bank was 200 billion, to us, I'm borrowing 1 million. Another person is borrowing 1 million, 10 million. On average, let's assume we are borrowing 1 million. This bank would require to sell to close to a million borrowers so that it can be able to give out loans of 200 billion. Can we 1 million borrowers? This means managers, more credit officers, more lawyers, more cashiers, you do so many loan agreements. And these people, when they start to default, because defaulting is obvious, and as we speak, the default rate of non-performing loans in Kenya is about 18%. But you'll never hear the government of Kenya having defaulted. At least we have not heard about that. Now, it is so much cost for the bank hiring all these people to manage our loan for portfolios. So if the same bank is given an option to give 200 billion Kenya shillings to just one borrower. And that is the government of Kenya, who is also considered a risk-free borrower. Really, which bank would let go that offer? And it is for that reason why I commend and recommend the government of Kenya to sell these Safaricom shares so that they can reduce their appetite for borrowing locally and domestically, so that you and me, whether it is a macro, small, medium enterprise or an SME, it gets a fair chance to borrow and access credit locally. I keep saying that there's a concept in accounting referred as mental accounting. And mental accounting is when you decide to save 100,000 with the bank on the promise that they would give you a return of 5%. And at the same time, you go to the same bank and borrow 100,000 at an interest cost of 20%, which means at the end of the year, you pay more than what you are earning from that 100,000. Does that make sense? Is that logical? So when the government of Kenya is selling these shares, it is avoiding exactly that. So selling part of Safaricom shares is not selling a national strategic asset recklessly, but it is a way of making a rational financial decision, because we need to reduce our appetite for debts and therefore increase the debt service, the amount of money that we use to service the debts. Selling Safaricom shares, it is more about long-term strategic planning instead of having short-term comfort on the name that we own Safaricom. Let's use facts and not emotions when making this decision and when advising the government on which way forward. When you know better, you do better.